launch? Theodora asked me to be her interlocutor tonight, and I was pretty happy about that because, as she said, I have seen pretty much everything that she's done in New York. Franklin Furness presented her work in 1977 when she was performing in it herself. And so I thought I would start the discussion with a question that we all need to know in order to understand this artist and how she works. And that is, when exactly did you get the bug? Did you find out that you were an artist, and did you realize that this was what you had to do?
I was always making things as a child, and especially sewing things, and making a lot of things to wear and a lot of body coverings. And
let's back up and tell everybody where you were raised.
So I was in San Francisco, and I grew up in a pretty strict household where my sister and I, weren't allowed to go out much, and we could only really socialize with other Greek kids and Greek families. And one thing was my sister got her driver's license, and we were in high school, and so we could go out on Sunday afternoons with the car, and we were near Golden Gate Park, about 10 minutes from Golden Gate Park. And so I was always making things like costumes out of 2,200 walnut shells, or animal bones, or feathers, or baby bottle nipples, just entire constructions. And then I would also use acrylic paint and paint my face and my arms and parts of my body. And so I would leave with the props in the back seat of the car. And then I would put paint on in the car as my sister was driving me to the park. And then I put the costumes on, and she was instructed to keep the motor running in case the performance was really bad. So we would drive along and look for a place where there were people sitting or standing or something. And she'd go a few feet ahead and keep the motor running, and I would come out and I would do these short performances. They never had words to them. They were always some kind of movement. And sometimes they had a message, like I would make a sign. They'd have a political message, support the great boycott or whatever. And there were a lot of times when the performances lasted about 90 seconds, and I knew it was like not working. And then I would run into the car, and there would be like, I don't know, I would use olive oil or something to get all the paint off and get changed back in. And then by the time we got back to my house, no one ever knew what we had done. So I must have done that about 25 times when I was in high school. So I think that was my artwork at the time.
So we have a clandestine, a stealth performance artist here. So then, what came? Is this for Theodora?
Sure.
Okay.
Or should we share this, or?
No, I have a mic in my pocket.
Oh, mine
All for
must
you.
not be working. Yeah.
What, did you identify as an artist yet, or can you explain your motivation for doing performance for unwitting audiences in the park?
It had to do with some sort of message, and it also had to do with, I don't think I understood it at the time, but I think a lot of us who became performance artists later knew that our body was a vehicle for the message somehow, or for an impression, or something like that. So I was always making things that were sort of body scale, and they were for the body, they were to be worn, and they were, I guess, kind of communication, direct communication. So then I did go to Berkeley as an undergrad, and that was kind of a perfect moment because there were suddenly many public events and a lot of action in the streets and a lot of performances. So that, by then, I certainly knew that I was making things. So I was a sculptor, I was studying, and but I knew that I was wanting to perform a lot and perform outside encountering the public.
What was your major? What were you doing in? What did you call yourself in school?
I was an art student,
sculpture.
But I also did theater too.
Uh-huh.
Yeah.
Uh-huh. Then what happened? You got to New York?
I came to New York to go to graduate school because I thought I would study stage design. And immediately I understood that the streets in New York were very different than the streets in, say, Berkeley or Oakland or even San Francisco. And so I kind of went indoors. It didn't feel comfortable to just do these kind of casually conceived sort of run-ons into the street. So it actually took me indoors. But fortunately, at that very same time, a movement was rising, which in Soho, in downtown Manhattan, which was another wave of performance art, or one of the most recent waves of performance art. So that was also a perfect sort of situation for me and for a lot of artists, I think, like you.
So in the early days of Franklin Furnace, we asked...
Sorry, we're recording part of this.
Should I just hold it maybe?
Yeah. That should be good. Thank you.
Okay.
Franklin Furnace was located in Tribeca for 20 years on Franklin Street between West Broadway and Church, and artists used the inside, the outside, the backyard, the ceiling, the floor. They used pretty much the whole place as their organ of expression. Ann Messner, for example, did a performance which involved amplifying the keys of a typewriter to the street, so the people who were going to the courthouse down Franklin Street would hear this clacking noise as they went by. Could you describe the first piece that I ever saw you do at Franklin Furnace?
Well, you have to understand that it was such a wonderful time then, because you could have an idea for a performance, and so many of the performances at that time were really, really short. I mean, I think they were 20 minutes or less. But you could actually have a performance idea, and you could go to Martha Wilson, who had this space, and you would say, I think I have a piece that's maybe 15 to 20 minutes long. Could I do it in 2 weeks? And she would go, yeah. So you would actually get such a great chance to try out your work. So one of the first pieces I did at Martha's Space. I did at Franklin Furnace, and I think it was about 20 minutes long. And it was autobiographical, and it was called The Venus Cafe, which is the name of my father's luncheonette in San Francisco. And then I went on to do it again and again and to expand it, but that was certainly its first appearance. Yeah.
I was disappointed, shocked, and unhappy when Theodora transitioned out of performance art and into theater. In my opinion, theater and performance art are mutually opposed in that the goal of theater is to convince you that it's not Monday, that it's not freezing cold outside, but instead we're in France and it's the revolution, we're on the barricades. You're transported out of your regular life and into some other life. But the job of performance artists is to remind you that it's Monday. We're here in an academic situation, discussing the history of theater and the history of performance art. Generally speaking, performance artists never let you forget that it's happening now in real time. Laurie Anderson then screwed around with mixing theater and performance art together, and right now Franklin Furnace gave a grant to an artist, Julie Atlas Muse, who's performing at Abrons Art Center, and what she has done is she's stepped in and out of the frame throughout the whole performance. So you see her, she comes out as herself, and then she becomes Beauty of Beauty and the Beast, and her partner becomes the Beast in Beauty and the Beast. And then they go back to themselves, and then back to Beauty and the Beast. So they're messing and playing with both traditions and mingling them together. So explain to me, please, justify to me, please, why you decided to transition out of performance art and into being a director.
Yeah, I think that I made several pieces that were autobiographical, and I think that I felt at that time that I had to be the performer in these pieces because they were about the story of my life. But I was always making objects that I performed with. So as I got tired of autobiography and I wanted to talk about other things and bigger things than just myself, I started using more and more objects, and eventually I came onto what I was making, which were performing objects and, yes, puppet figures. And somehow, as I left my own life and got interested in other kinds of real life, like other kinds of documentary material, I also stepped away, and I preferred to be the director and to sort of frame the event. And for me, I don't see such an oppositional tug between certain kinds of performance art and theater. But certainly I became more of a director. I relied on the performing talents of many other people. And always the making of the objects, the performing objects. But for me, it's not as hard a divide between performance art and theater.
Well, and to give credit where credit's due, Theodora started to tell histories, the history of electricity, the invention of electricity, the history of medicine, the history of medicine, women in prison, had, as I believe, it had an Ebola virus that you had made out of fiberglass that was about yay big. And then the scale of puppets, one of whom had a leg amputated, was about yay big. And then there was also a person who was suffering from AIDS, who was a full-size person encased in a plastic bag. So it used wildly different forms of scale in the course of telling the story. So just say a few more words about the storytelling part of your...
I always love... I think I never worked with a play until about 10 years ago. I think up till then, I consider myself a collage artist that collages together pieces of text the way you would almost stitch together a piece of work.
2,200 walnut shells.
And I think that's what I was always doing, but I was always attracted to real material. For example, the material tonight are either speeches where there was actual, someone asking or begging to be listened to and to be convinced of something, and then there are some that are more reflective, like the little UNESCO one. But I always liked taking words that were actually there.
Who, along the way, in the course of your career, has influenced you profoundly?
I think in the early days of performance art, there were people like Carolee Schneemann, and certainly people like Vito Acconci, certainly people like Laurie Anderson. And then I did work early on with Richard Schechner before it became the Worcester Group, the performance group, and certainly Richard Foreman. I mean, there were those two communities, the art world and the theater world, lived in the same neighborhoods, and at times they really did not commingle. Some did socially, but some didn't at all. But I had really a foot in each world, I think. And did you as well? Yeah.
Yeah, we would go to see Richard Foreman and go to see Laurie Anderson also. Now I think I have asked my burning questions, and I want to know if anybody else has any burning questions that they wish to ask Theodora.
Yeah.
I would like to hear you talk about the collaboration with Judith in this work.
Oh, yeah. Well, there's actually a wonderful part about UNESCO that we're working on that we didn't get to yet. And so I had asked her, I said, would you like to write a few words when we introduce the UNESCO chair? And she wrote this very funny thing where she said, oh, welcome, it's Mr. UNESCO. I've always thought that a poet and a playwright should not only be witty, but wise. And you're getting there, Mr. UNESCO. You're pretty witty. But she has mixed feelings about UNESCO, and she had a wonderful way of expressing it.
Thank you. I have a question. What is a puppet in your definition, and is there a slight difference between what you might define as a puppet and what you might also define as a performance piece?
Okay. Kathy Shaw, where are you? I would love Kathy Shaw to answer this because she thinks long and hard about things that perform, and I just would be curious to hear how she would answer it.
Hi. I would say that anything can be a puppet, actually. It's the intentional way that you handle the object that turns an object like a spoon that you're using to feed yourself into a spoon that's suddenly a character or a creature or an object that has some sort of intention. That's my answer. And
we also have a really great artist with us tonight, too, Hannah Tierney. Mm-hmm. And I don't know if Hannah feels like saying what she thinks a performing object or a puppet is.
Well, I think puppetry is the art of gesture, and anything that can really make a gesture and let the gesture become a symbol that we all understand really falls into this category.
They did a much better job.
I have a question to Mrs. Wilson. How and where from you got this idea that performers supposed to be connected only to here and now? Any form of art, every piece of art, based first of all of imagination. And performers can take you whenever you wish, millenniums back and millenniums ahead, one place and another place. I cannot see any difference.
So you're agreeing with her?
You say that performance that's here and now, only here. Why?
Can you hear me?
Yeah, I think that's what I was hoping to describe. Well, what is the question?
Okay.
I disagree that performance.
Oh, you disagree that? Yeah. Okay.
But Judith also said something about. Are you addressing Judith or Martha?
She's pointing at me.
Martha.
Martha. Okay. Okay.
Not for you, the question. Sorry.
Performance art is descended from a visual art tradition, and I believe, and there's no agreement as to where the first performance art work took place. For example, Rosalie Goldberg in her book makes Ubu Roy the first performance artwork, but that is a work of theater, in my opinion. I believe the first performance artwork was when the Italian futurists printed 800,000 copies of their manifesto called Against Passeist Venice, and then went up the clock tower and waited for people to come out of church. This is in 1910. And when the faithful were coming out of church, they started throwing their manifesto off the clock tower into the Piazza San Marco, and the people picked it up and read that, oh, Venice is passé and should be allowed to float into the Adriatic Sea and sink. So they became angry, and they ran up the clock tower, and the poets and painters ran down the clock tower, and they had a fist fight in the stairwell. So I take that moment of physical confrontation as the beginning of performance art, because performance art is often the embodiment of an idea, usually with the body of the artist, often a confrontational idea, an idea that is maybe not so acceptable to regular people.
I was just going to say that I know it's something that Theodora, you and I have talked about over the last year or so. This whole question now of what is performance art and what is theater. It's actually been going on since the late 70s very much in terms of the criticism and critical writing. But since Judith's here, I just want to say that every time I do some research on performance, it's interesting that the living theater in its own space and in its relationships with artists had many visual artists and dancers,
Right.
and in the same venue. And then that was in the late 50s and 60s. And many of the happenings and concerts and all kinds of things by people that we identify with the visual arts world became more separate, the worlds in the 70s, but then periodically kind of moving closer together and then separating. And I think one of the things that was interesting about the show that you were recently in, Theodora, the Rituals of Rented Island at the Whitney, was that it was one of the first times that a museum actually brought together theater people and people from the visual arts world.
That's true.
In terms of the making of a history of performance. And that's a big theme that I've been very interested in for quite a long time now. And I think the confusion comes from how we use the term performance and performance art and theater, and because there's another question now that performance art is thought to be moving closer and closer to theater in recent years, especially with what we see in New York. So it's a really complicated, fascinating issue that we actually have two histories of performance, one from the visual arts and one from theater. The question is, how do we bring them together for a larger, more comprehensive view?
Thank you.
I'd also like to hear Judith Molina on the subject that you were just talking about, and speaking about both the divisions between the arts, particularly the performance art and theater, but also the visual arts, the divisions, how she sees the divisions, and how the living theater embodied and embodies in the present tense a coming together of some of those disciplines.
Jason, could you actually?
Question was,
yes.
How did the living theater embody and embrace the differences between performance art and live theater?
It's a very interesting question. In fact, it's a deep concern of everyone in the living theater in terms of what are we saying and how are we saying it? Which is basically the foundation of all interesting theater work. I certainly found it in Theodora's use of Ionesco. I find it in many good works. Wherever there is an ensemble and a director who is working on ideas. And my problem with Ionesco, and it's not my problem with Ionesco as Theodora interprets it, because I think that's just what should be done with a play of that sort. That is that I think that Ionesco is a wit, is a brilliant, expressive, witty, intelligent writer. On the other hand, I fault him for not taking this into an activist position where each person hearing the play has to come to some conclusion within his or herself about what this means to him or to her. And that's a very personal thing, and it will differ. It will differ from spectator to spectator, and it will differ from company to company, and from the interpretation of the work. what I admire about what Theodora does is that she does give an underlying political voice to the chairs. Instead of the chairs being inanimate objects, which in UNESCO, as I understand it, can really never be filled. In Theodora's interpretation, they are fulfilled. And they're fulfilled by the speeches of the past and the aspirations of the present. That is us, the spectator participant, who has to in some way make an interpretation out of the director's interpretation of the playwright's interpretation. And I don't agree with the UNESCO's interpretation of the chair, but I do agree very strongly with Theodora Skipitares' interpretation.
Thank you, Judith. We could leave it right there.
Yeah.
That was pretty great.
Yeah, I had a question, Theodora. Do you believe that art in general, not just theater or performance art, should be political? And then what do you, because so growing up in Greece, I remember being taught art for the sake of art being completely dismissed, and students from even as young as 16, like in high school, being pushed to make art that is very political, and that's how it should be. And then that kind of carries on for like young artists in their 20s and 30s, also kind of make art in that mindset. So I don't know, I was wondering if you...
Well, I just want to... I can't answer such a big sweeping statement, but I can just say that in spite of myself, I always want to make puppets that have an agenda or have a message. And a lot of people don't like my work because of that. And sometimes some people feel I overburden my puppet works with language, which can be a real problem sometimes, just literalness, So, yes, for me, I'm always interested in work that has a message or that has a political aspiration. And by the way, I think we're in the middle of a phase right now, especially in the visual arts, where there are some really great artists who are doing social practice art that is just thrilling and really expansive and really great. Mm-hmm. So we're lucky we're in that period again. I think we are. Okay. Or maybe not.
Thank you.
Okay, thank you
very much.
Thank you. That was so much fun.
Really quickly, just want to thank one more time both the legendary artists here, Martha Wilson.
Yay!
And Theodora Skipitares. And of course, and of course, Judith Molina as well for her participation. We would be thrilled if you would all join us around the corner at the Archive Bar. We're going to be having a little reception at the Archive Bar. It's on 35th, I believe. The address is on your programs. I'm sorry, I don't have it in front of me. But we'll be moving that way for some drinks and to toast to Theodora. So thank you very much. 36. Sorry.